An initial trade agreement between China and the U.S. takes effect today, on Friday. It means some bilateral tariffs will be either slashed or lifted. But the U.S. has left the steepest duties in place, for now, that is. And the brewing viral epidemic means there's likely to be an extra hurdle for some importers and exporters. Take a look.
Signed 1 month ago and now in force.
A transformative deal that will bring tremendous benefits to both countries.
And partially restoring normal service between the world's most important trading partners.
On the basis of equality and mutual respect, we have reached this Phase 1 trade agreement.
But leveling what President Trump deemed an unfair playing field comes at a cost. China is buying more U.S. goods and services while improving both market access and intellectual property protection for American companies doing business there. In exchange, Washington is reducing and lifting some of the tariffs, effectively taxing the entire volume of Chinese imports into the U.S. But there's a huge caveat. And if the current deal provides some trade relief, there's concern about the impact of shutdowns imposed by the coronavirus.
We haven't heard China ask yet for any special treatment or waiver of certain deadlines because of the outbreak, but we've heard Larry Kudlow and other advisors around the president suggest that China probably will, at least in the short term, struggle to reach some of its purchase commitments.
While China acknowledges any economic impact would spill over to other countries, it says enough is being done to minimize the fallout.
For more on the China-U.S. trade agreement coming into force, joining us in Hong Kong is Edward Xie, CEO of Gaofeng Advisory Company. In Washington, D.C., Jeff Moon, former assistant U.S. trade rep for China. And in New York, last but not least, we want to also welcome Robert Hormat, vice chairman of the Kissinger Associates. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. First of all, Mr. Xie, there's one Chinese voice among all the panelists today because of the difficulties of inviting guests into our studio due to the outbreak. So with you representing somewhat the Chinese stance, help us understand what is the latest from China's perspective in terms of the tariffs and also in terms of proceed with the agreement.
Well, as you know, the discussion on the trade, with the U.S. government was just finishing, and then the coronavirus sort of came out from almost from nowhere, and China was under double shock in a very short period of time, and it's created a lot of strain to the China system, and even now a lot of businesses are still closed or semi-closed. A lot of economic activities are really down. And right now the focus of the whole country is on really trying to address the issue of the coronavirus and try to sort of get rid of it. And on top of that, we've got the Phase 1 of the trade agreement now starting today. So it's somewhat of a double whammy to the China system today.
I see. Mr. Hormat, you've been working and also interacting with China for decades. Let me ask you also about that. China has been experiencing some challenges over the past 4 decades, to say the least. What do you make of the latest in terms of its impact on the immediate result of its economy? And how is that likely to be trickling down to the relations, trade particularly, between China and U.S.? Your perspective, sir.
Well, it certainly will slow the Chinese economy down. China's been through periods of this type in the past, but now you have this new trade agreement. I think it is entirely appropriate that China devote its attention and its efforts as a nation to dealing with the coronavirus. The implications for trade with the U.S. at the moment are of secondary or tertiary importance. And the United States has to understand that a country that is experiencing slower growth, where there will not be as much travel, where a lot of businesses that supply to American companies will be closed or semi-closed. A lot of movie theaters won't be showing American movies, or any movies for that matter, and people will not perhaps be consuming as much or going to the malls as much. So at this point, there will be inevitably some reduction in American sales to China of a variety of things. The U.S. has to understand this is an extenuating circumstance. China is appropriately developing programs to deal with the coronavirus, and it will have a temporary impact on American trade. And the U.S. has to understand this and not make a big political issue over it or a big trade issue over it. It'll come. This will be dealt with over time. The Chinese are doing a good job, I think, in attempting to deal with it. But the United States has to give China time and be understanding if demand for American goods slows substantially, which it may.
Mr. Moon, according to the U.S.-China Business Council Vice President, now many of the U.S. businesses did not expect such a thing, meaning a slowdown in the provision of goods coming from the Chinese side as a result of this lockdown and shutdown of businesses due to the prevention and control of the coronavirus. Now, also you have Federal Reserve talking about there is likely to be some impact from the virus, even though it did not specifically give details as to what extent. Mr. Moon, what do you think might be the impact on the U.S. business from the trade perspective as well? What do you make also of your colleague, Mr. Hormat's view that U.S. should be understanding the current realities China is facing right now and thinking about long term?
I agree with Mr. Hormat's view that China's priority has to be the coronavirus, and we need to take that into account. But we need to think carefully about what the impact is going to be and what it won't be. The coronavirus will impact in-person work and consumption. And history teaches us, there have been several of these kinds of virus outbreaks. History teaches us that the impact is going to be temporary, maybe several months. The Phase 1 trade deal is a 2-year agreement, and it involves 2 large baskets of things. It involves policy changes, which are not in-person activities that can be implemented almost immediately, and then it involves the purchases of goods that will be impacted. And as I said, this is a 2-year agreement. The majority of the purchases actually happen in the second year, not in the first year. So I think that we need to remember that this is a temporary phenomenon. We need to work through it. But I think that with good faith on both sides, that we can fulfill the terms of the agreement over the long term.
Yeah. Mr. Xie, your response, particularly general picture of the Chinese economy, IMF suggesting it's likely to be a V sign in a way going down, but coming up back after the outbreak comes to an end. Meanwhile, China and the U.S. immediate longer term, Mr. Xie.
Certainly, the coronavirus is having a severe short-term impact on the Chinese economy. I anticipate the first quarter of this year, the economic growth rate is going to be pretty minimal. Second quarter, there may be a little bit of an increase, but still going to be pretty tough. I would expect, however, that with the coronavirus receding, hopefully, by the end of before the end of the second quarter, the rest of the year we're going to see a very strong rebound. In fact, as you know, in China we are already talking about, or we are already experiencing about, very vibrant activities in a number of sectors. For example, online, education, distributed working methods, and so on. So we expect there will be activities along these dimensions beyond the virus that is going to, be a driver for economic growth. In addition to the government's effort in providing the fixed asset investment, which I think is going to happen. So I think the second half of this year we're going to see a very strong rebound. in China's economy?
It has a lot to do with how Chinese economy will be like. It also has a lot to do with how the two sides are going to implement their own commitments. And it has a lot to do with how the two countries and the two people see one another. Mr. Hormats, since I'm asking that question, I have to get your views about how the U.S. and the U.S. people are seeing China. We have been seeing media reports suggesting, for example, the Wall Street Journal editorial the other day was using so-called the sick man of East Asia. Now, that was a very much an offending phrase if you know China's history. We also heard from the Commerce Ministry not long ago, not necessarily very friendly remarks, but at the same time we see different voices in the administration even. Mr. Kudlow, for example, have been expressing sympathies and empathies toward China, and some of the other officials as well. So how should we understand, Mr. Hormat, the mixture of voices that is now in the U.S. society, particularly here in China? You do not see many people could still travel to the U.S. due to the travel ban. So how should we understand what the U.S. is thinking, whether from the government or from the general society, Mr. Hormat?
Well, first of all, let me say I agree with the point that was made. This is a 2-year agreement. And even if there's a slowdown in Chinese purchases during the period of the coronavirus and dealing with it, it's a longer-term agreement. And I do think over a period of time, the key elements of the agreement will begin to emerge again, and the numbers will grow as the Chinese economy recovers. I very much agree with that. What I was worrying about in particular at the moment is we shouldn't be impatient and demand that China deal with this right away. The coronavirus is what they really need to deal with right away, not so much buying American goods right away. That's going to slow down. But long term, there'll be a different and a better story.
Yeah.
The point you've made is a very good one. I think that there is the biggest deficit in the imbalance, or the biggest imbalance between the two countries, really is, in a way, a trust imbalance that has developed over the last several years. And I think that we're not going to be able to move effectively toward phase 2 or this new strategic economic dialogue and confine it only to trade. We've got to have a much deeper dialogue among political leaders and strategic thinkers on how to strengthen overall relations between the United States and China over not the next 1 or 2 or 3 years, but over the next decade. And you can't isolate trade from the broader dialogue to develop strategic understandings between the two countries and to reduce that large trust imbalance that has emerged. Because as long as that emerges, and as long as there are a lot of misgivings and suspicions on the security side, it's because so many trade issues in high tech relate not just to commercial issues, but to potential strategic issues for technology. As long as that strategic misunderstanding or mistrust continues, it's going to lead people who want to reduce technology trade or technology interaction, or even, as Jennifer said in the earlier piece, scientific collaboration. A lot of that is suffering because of this trust deficit, and a lot of it because we're not really dealing with some of the broader strategic understandings which we need to underpin or complement improved trade relations. And we'll have more divisions if we don't deal with those issues in the next round, not just trade, but the broader strategic relationship.
Mr. Moon, I want to ask the same or similar question. Now, at a time of human disasters such as virus and the outbreak of virus, what do you make of some of the very mixed voices in your society about what China needs to face right now in terms of fighting the virus and the survival of the people, Mr. Moon?
I think the key here is transparency. As you said earlier in the program, or some of the guests said,
transparency in your society or in my society. I'm asking you about how would you respond to the mixed voices in your society regarding China's right now fight against the coronavirus, particularly if I could mention the early Wall Street Journal report, which they later apologized. and also some remarks from your Commerce Secretary suggesting it could be a good opportunity for American businesses. Of course, I do not want to deny, and I want to emphasize here, in fact, there are many other very positive, very friendly voices coming from your society as well toward China, from the business community, from the general public, from the organizations, civil societies. But how should we, people here in China, not many of them would be able to travel to the U.S. due to the travel ban. How should we understand this mix of voices coming out of the U.S.? Which one are the voices that we should trust or not?
We need to remain focused on building the relationship, fostering the international cooperation that will serve the bilateral relationship, and also help us deal with this coronavirus threat. And we need to exercise demonstrations of goodwill. The U.S. business community has sent millions of dollars of medical products to China, for example, which is very helpful. And we need to tune out those who are spreading rumors and trying to sow distrust. And in the specific context of the coronavirus situation, I really do think, as I said before, transparency, getting the real facts out, getting experts, international experts on the ground is key to dispelling all of these problems and letting everyone know that people are working in good faith for the benefit of all.
Great point. Mr. Xie, now, from what we are having right now, this is in the very middle of this fight against the coronavirus outbreak. We have an overall battle in Wuhan and in Hubei province. We heard earlier in our program also, more than 15,000 medical workers were actually infected by the virus. That's a very big number if we think about the fight that we need to fight right now. Mr. Xie, we do not know when is the end of this battle. So what is, from China's perspective, the best way to work with the international community and also work with the American counterparts on trade and also on international collaboration regarding the outbreak and some of the other issues, eventually to build trust, hopefully, Mr. Xie?
Yeah, the priority right now is absolutely try to deal with the coronavirus, and China as a whole country is really mobilizing a lot of resources against this issue. At the same time, we already have been seeing a lot of support from many other countries in the world, including the USA, but also many other countries who have pledged to support in various forms, in particular in terms of materials and also the expertise to help China to address this issue. I think this is a very good sign. China needs to continue to work and be very open to collaborate with the international community with this focus on addressing the issue. The issue that we're now facing is not a national issue. This is really in a way, unfortunately, it's a global issue because the virus really doesn't know national borders. A lot of people, unfortunately, in many other countries have already been inflated by the virus. And I think this is now an important time for many countries, if not all the countries in the world, to try to address this issue on a collaborative basis rather than thinking about their own issues on a national basis. I think from this standpoint, this is somewhat of a silver lining, because as you know, before this virus, the mood of the world was very much towards more nationalism, protectionism, me first, you last, that kind of mentality, which of course was not very healthy. But this virus hopefully would change somewhat of that kind of mindset.
Is this the silver lining that could really happen? Mr. Hormats, are you that optimistic that people could move their eyes away a bit and to take a look at the real global challenges? Public health is one of them, even between China and the United States, Mr. Hormats?
I hope so. I think this is a very, very important point that you just heard, that many of the issues in the world today do not know borders. They transcend borders. And pandemics are one, climate is another. There are a wide range of other issues that governments are going to have to work together on in order to deal with successfully. And it may well be that this reminds us, in a very tragic way, unfortunately, that when something of this nature occurs, it is not a national issue, one nation versus another, and it would be exactly the wrong thing for the United States to be critical of China or to say adverse things about China. The key is to work together, and I think more and more of the issues, even financial contamination, financial crises, health crises, climate crises, countries have to work together, and it may well be that it reminds countries that it's not America first or any other country first. It's a collective set of actions that are required. We should be supportive of China. Many companies are, and many parts of the U.S. government are, in our Center for Disease Control, for instance. But we've got to do this on a broader basis and a sustained basis.
Okay, Mr. Moon, you only have 30 seconds left before we wrap up.
Well, all I would say is I agree on the importance of working together on transnational issues. In terms of bilateral issues, there's a lot that can be done. We hear about the presidential phone calls, but I know from having worked in the White House that most of the on-the-ground work happens by video conference between Washington and Beijing. In the trade context, all of that can continue, and discussions about a Phase 2 deal can start as well, and policy discussions about how to implement IPR and other commitments within China can also continue. So I think we need to recognize the importance, but do what we can.
Thank you so much. The three of you, really appreciate it. Jeff Moon, Edward Xie, last but not least, Robert Hormats. Thank you so much, gentlemen.